Hi, people. So, I want to talk about the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This bloc of countries is widely described as a sort of counter to Western hegemony. Um, Now, there's an enormous amount to say about the subject, so I'm going to try and make this somewhat condensed, otherwise, the video will just go on forever. But I think it's an appropriate time to talk about this. Well, it's always an appropriate time, actually. Um, because the emergence of the BRICS, the rise of the BRICS, and the sort of how it plays out in the near future, I think is going to be one of the big geopolitical stories of our time. So they've just had a summit in Johannesburg in South Africa. I believe it was a suburb of Johannesburg. Um, and at that meeting, it was announced that the group would expand, and other countries have been invited to join. And if I've got this right, the other countries are Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Um, Now, none of those countries are surprising. They're all either growing economies, big countries in terms of population, or there's other factors that mean they're not surprising choices. But what is interesting is there's some big countries that are notably absent from this invitation to expand. Now, whether that's just part of the process, like they're going to be invited later on or something, I don't know. But off the top of my head, Mexico, Nigeria, Indonesia, Vietnam, those are four countries that are all either middle income or developing countries with big populations, and they're curiously not included in this expansion. Bangladesh, for that matter, um, Pakistan, where are they? Well, Pakistan's absence may be explained by an Indian veto, potentially. I don't know if that's like, I'm not saying India has vetoed, but one can imagine that would be the case. Um, but yeah, there's still some quite significant countries in terms of population size and geopolitical significance that are left off. So that's curious. In terms of where the BRICS are right now, it could be easy to overstate their importance in terms of this big, intimidating monolith that's sort of going against the West. Well, at the summit in South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa was careful to stress that the BRICS are not in antithesis to the West, they're not anti West. But I think, realistically, there is definitely at least part of the BRICS agenda is to sort of counter the West, and there will be some ideology involved in that, likely along the lines of rebuking Western neocolonialism. That's not my words, but that would be the perceptive of some. Um, I think there's no doubt that that is part of it. Um, but how much of a threat or an adversary is the BRICS to Western countries? That's the question. On the surface, it's a very significant bloc. I mean, you've got the world's two most populous countries, India and China, and collectively they account for 40% of the world's population. You have the world's second biggest economy. You have, and the other four are large economies. Although Russia, I'd say its economy has definitely been weakened since the sanctions last year. Um, so, on the surface, is a pretty significant bloc. But in reality, I think, it's likely that the BRICS may not remain that united. Certainly, I think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin would love the BRICS to grow as a sort of, bloody nose to the West. But if you look at its makeup, I mean, ideologically, there's going to be significant differences there. India and China, for example, um, notwithstanding the fact China is an autocracy and India, for now at least, remains a democracy. Um, there is their long-standing territorial tensions in the Himalayas. So, how can its two most populous members, if put it this way, if within the European Union we now have Brexit, but within the European Union, the UK and France were always bickering over various issues. and the UK and France are both like-minded Western liberal democracies. So if there could be tensions within the European Union, and that's just one example, there are many others, and the EU is comprised of broadly like-minded Western democracies, then how can a bloc that consists of the world's biggest democracy and the world's biggest autocracy possibly, agree? There may be some areas they sort of find common ground on, perhaps, rebuking Western critique of human rights or something like that. But I think whatever unites them, there may be more that divides them. Um, Putin didn't attend the summit in person. Lavrov went instead because the South Africans would have been obliged to arrest him because of the, international arrest summit from the Hague. But I don't know if the South Africans would have even done it if Putin had showed up in person. They would have been obliged to, but there would have been a big fallout for them. And I think probably secretly President Ramaphosa was relieved that Putin didn't turn up because it meant that it didn't put his government in the position of having to make that decision, which they would be obliged to do. But it would have also there would have been backlash from developing countries against South Africa had they done that, or against the Russophile countries, from the Russophile countries, excuse me. But nevertheless, Putin addressed the summit and apparently got cheers by his video link as he claimed perversely that he was forced to act in Ukraine to end the war against Russia by the West. Now, only the truly brainwashed or Russian nationalists at this point really believe that this was a war. I'm talking about Ukraine, of course, that was started by the West. Um, the reason NATO has expanded, the reason Sweden and Finland has joined, in large part, as the Finnish president said, was because they've been pushed into it by Russia's actions. This is the irony. Russia alleges that the West has long provoked Russia by NATO expansion, but countries are joining NATO precisely because of Russia's belligerent behaviour. I mean, Russia doesn't exactly, you know, sweeten the offer for its surrounding countries to join the Russophile. It's all basically threats and intimidation. So for Russia to play the victim, and this is one of the narratives that Russia uses in its propaganda, is it's really perverse. It's kind of like the burglar, entering a house and claiming to be a victim of theft. It's just, it's outrageous. It's laughable. It's obscene. But it's not so laughable because a lot of people get taken in by this propaganda. And I don't want to derail the topic here, but when Prigozhin, in all likelihood, died in that plane sabotage in Russia, it appears that there was a bomb on board. There was Africans giving vigils to him. This is a terrorist, a petty criminal turned leading thug. I mean, Prigozhin was not a good man. Even Wagner supporters were saying almost he's earned a place in hell. He's got his place in hell. But they weren't saying that. They were almost saying that triumphantly, like they're proud of the fact that he is a callous thug. And the neo-Nazi who died with him, Utkin, I believe his name was. These were bad people. So their demise in of itself is no bad thing. But as one Russian, anonymous Russian, said, they hope they kill each other. I think the Times interviewed people, and one Russian anonymous dissident said, let's hope they kill each other. Because it's really, if Putin did kill Prigozhin, it's frankly, if Prigozhin had killed Putin, it would be the same sort of situation. It's in terms of, well, yeah, one is gone, but the other remains, kind of thing. So I certainly don't grieve for Prigozhin, but Putin's still in power, so it's kind of, critics of Prigozhin can't be overly triumphalist because Putin remains in power. Um, but when it comes to the BRICS, again, there's a question of leadership because, and I made this in my previous video, India is the world's biggest democracy. There has been a lot of disappointment in the West that India has failed to be more outspoken on Russia and Ukraine. It's kind of sat on the fence. In my opinion, it's been a little bit cowardly, frankly, in terms of speaking out. And maybe for India, this is just geopolitical maneuvering, but I think it's a failure of leadership of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of the world's biggest democracy to basically sit on the fence and fail to condemn Russia's aggression against against a sovereign state by an autocracy. And it's quite clear that this is because they don't want to upset the Russians. So the question then is, what sort of sway does Russia have on India? India's a bigger economy. It's a much bigger country in terms of population, but it is important to look at history because for a lot of the Cold War, India was outwardly pro-Soviet Union. I don't know if we've ever been under the illusion that India is pro-West. It's not. It's not necessarily anti-West either, but I don't think we can fully trust India, quite honestly, to put it bluntly. I don't think we can fully trust India as a kind of geopolitical democratic partner. And that's a great pity. I would like a situation where India was much closer allied to the West whilst maintaining its own sovereignty and its own. Um, but the non-aligned route India's taken, which by the way is it's right as a sovereign nation. Any sovereign nation in the world has a right to join any bloc it so chooses. Which by the way is Ukraine's right. If Ukraine wants to join NATO, this is the hypocrisy of some African and Asian nations to say, oh, well, NATO's expanding and the Ukrainians have no right to choose their own destiny. Well, wait a second, you're saying that you're sovereign nations and you have a right to choose your own destiny. So why don't they respect the right of the Ukrainians? Or indeed the Finns and the Swedes? You know, it's sheer hypocrisy to sort of say, well, give Russia what it wants. But by the way, don't tell us what to do. So whether that be Kenyans or um, other countries in the developing world, what right do they have to tell the Ukrainians to give up their land? I'll just get Putin what he wants. That's an outrageous position. One thing that does encourage me is the UN vote earlier this year was overwhelmingly calling on Russia to withdraw. But there were still, I believe it was 36 countries that abstained, including China. Only a very small number of countries outwardly backed Russia, but those countries that abstained are perhaps more significant than those who backed Russia, because the ones who backed Russia were just predictable little tin pot tyrannies. Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, Syria, the usual suspects. So none of them are surprising or really, frankly, that worrying for the West. I think the bigger issue is the abstentions. Um, I think that with the divisions in the BRICS, I'm not overly worried about its threat to the West. I think the practical approach for the West going forward is to not overreact to the rise of BRICS, not sort of act like it's some sort of big threat, because I don't think it is, and I think there's no reason why we can't still have positive relations with individual BRIC members. For example, Brazil. We've got fairly good relations with Brazil. I don't see any reason why that shouldn't continue. Um, there may be issues like, for example, Brazil would, in all likelihood, back Argentina if there was any renewed conflict over the Falklands. But other than that, Brazilian British relations are relatively good. There's no major issues of difference. UK South African relations are relatively okay. UK India relations, I've covered this in the last video, they're far from perfect, but I wouldn't say it's terrible. I wouldn't say, certainly it's much better than the situation between Britain and China. Um, Russia, well, it's terrible at the moment, there's no question about that. Our relations with Russia and China are pretty bad right now. China, I mentioned world's second biggest economy. The Chinese economy may be in a serious problem right now. Now, I'm not an economist. I'm not even, I don't follow economics as closely as I probably should. But if China is indeed facing a serious economic problem, well, firstly, we shouldn't be too triumphalist because it will have effects on the rest of the world. but it may dent Chinese confidence a bit. Um, and certainly, I think it's a good thing if the arrogant wolf warrior diplomats get a bloody nose, metaphorically speaking, because for a long time now, there's been this very jingoistic, quite aggressive nationalism coming from China. So if they get a little bit humbled, that's not a bad thing, in my opinion. Um, but time will tell. And the thing is, unlike Russia, if the Chinese economy collapses, it will have an adverse effect on the West. So we shouldn't be too triumphalist about that. Um, I mean, the world is still dealing with the aftermath of COVID, which almost certainly began in China, and look how that affected the rest of the world. So, anything that happens in China has an effect on the rest of the world. It's a country that is absolutely pivotal in terms of geopolitics. All those countries are important, but China above any other. Russia, as we've seen with Ukraine, Russia can certainly make an impact in geopolitics. Economically, though, it's weak. Um, you have to. I'm reading a book by Luke Harding, who was a Guardian journalist who spent time in Russia, and he visited Putin youth camps where they were boasting they would be the world's third biggest economy in a generation and soar past the British. Now they're, I don't know where they rank, 12th, 13th. Russia's, that's one thing about Russia. It's never been a particularly impactful economy, unlike China. And it's highly unlikely that they will become that way. Putin runs a gangster regime. It's absolutely rotten with corruption. So I think Russia has been weakened in the last year. I mean, it's still powerful enough to have propaganda influence. It's still powerful enough, to invade a sovereign country and occupy that country. Um, it's still powerful enough to, have influence in every part of the world. But I do think Russian power has been tested and weakened. If we talk about Russia in August 2023 versus, say, August 2021, I think there's no question Russia has been weakened, even if it still enjoys some support from idiots um, and some geopolitical appeasement. But I think there is a real danger in the American presidential election next year. God forbid if a Putin appeaser gets into power, whether they be from the Republicans or the Democrats, because this is something, unfortunately, that crosses both sides. The Republicans certainly have plenty of Putin appeasers and Putin apologists, but the Democrats aren't immune from them. There's Robert Kennedy Jr., who is a shameless figure in my opinion, an absolute disgrace, who sullies the Kennedy family name. I think he's an unhinged conspiracy nut, and I think that he is also a shameless Putin appeaser. And I hope to God he doesn't get anywhere near the White House. But there's others I do not trust. Tulsi Gabbard, she's a bit more clever than Kennedy. She's not so outwardly pro-Putin, but I do not trust her. Um, I do question her foreign policy ideology. She presents herself as a pacifist, but she has went out of her way to basically play the devil's advocate for foreign dictators. She doesn't outright praise them, but I don't trust her. Um, any aspiring American president at this point who wants to appease Putin, cut funding to Ukraine, or in any way, shape, or form enable Putin, I think is not fit to be in the White House. And I think that would be a real danger to the West if a Putin sympathizer got into power. I think that would be really abhorrent. I'm going to make another video specifically on American power and the situation in the United States because I think it's very important um, and affects the rest of the democratic world, indeed the world. But going forward, my approach to the BRICS, if I was Rishi Sunak, I would say maintain positive relations as much as possible with individual countries whilst being assertive. And if the BRICS were to collectively take a position, for example, backing Putin's war in Ukraine, I think the West should collectively also take a position. Meanwhile, I think it makes absolute geopolitical sense to strengthen Western institutions and Western bodies If NATO expands, that's a good thing. If that is a sovereign, independent decision of countries, um, and NATO should, basically follow suit, say this expansion is not a threat to any individual country. It's a sovereign right of nations to do this, and it's for security reasons. So, we need to show we too can play this game of expansion. Um, could it end up in this sort of polarized world between, wealthy, developed Western countries versus the developing world? I think that would be a very sad and regressive way to look at the world. But we have to be very, very assertive. When we look at what's happening in West Africa, for example, France is really getting a pushback from that because it's a former colonial power, and Russia is really trying to vilify France. Um, and similar things could happen in former British colonies, former Spanish colonies, and so on, whereby the European powers are presented as neo-colonialist, even though we give a lot of humanitarian aid to these countries. If you look at the United States, one of the good things the Bush administration done was extensive funding for malaria. So I think there needs to be a lot more, frankly, propaganda, positive propaganda, that focuses on the good things that the West does in developing countries. Because this, portrayal of the West as being this overbearing neo-colonialist power, we need to show developing countries that we are not treating them as, um, we need to show them that we're seeing them on a level playing field, and we're not treating them not level playing field economically, because that simply isn't the way, but respectful. So definitely there is some effort required by Western countries in this regard, but we also have to defend ourselves from false allegations. From the likes of Russia and China. We need to push back hard. I think we need to be much, much more assertive on our own territory. I think in Britain, I've long argued we need to be, we've got assertive with Russia since what happened last year, but I think we're still not assertive enough of China. I think we need to be much more robust in China's nefarious activities in this country. Much more robust. I think universities need to face scrutiny for exactly how much they're pandering to Beijing, for example. Um, and I just think we need to be more assertive all round. So this is going to be a major issue going forward, but that's my thoughts on the BRICS as it stands in 2023. I think it needs to be taken seriously, but I'm not unduly alarmed because I think there's significant differences within the BRICS. Let me know your thoughts.